What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and we're doing another Darktide video. A couple weeks ago, I did a video on some tips and tricks for new players, mostly stuff that was not very well documented within the game. And a lot of you also left comments down on the video with some pretty good suggestions for stuff that I hadn't touched on. And so I decided to do a follow-up, and what we're going to be doing is talking about some more tips for new players that you might not know. As always, if you like my content, especially my Warhammer 40k or Darktide content, hit the like on the video, subscribe on the channel, all that YouTube stuff. You know the drill. You've heard the speeches a million times before. And let's talk about some frickin' Darktide. Team coordination is basically king. The first portion of this is coherency. Obviously, as they teach you in the tutorial, you regenerate toughness while in coherency. You can cover for each other. Depending on the class, there are also some other benefits to keeping coherency. Some of the more powerful of these are unlocked by feats. For example, Ogren giving faster toughness regeneration and Zealot giving a toughness damage resistance. So if you have a wide variety of characters on your team, you're actually going to stack up the most coherency bonuses, and your characters are going to feel a lot more powerful while standing near each other. It's also important to stick with your allies when they jump down to new sections of the map. In order to stop you from camping, the game actually likes to spawn elite enemies behind you if you're standing on a ledge or another area before progressing into a section of the level that you can't backtrack to. This is to prevent classes like Psyker or Sharpshooter from trying to clear out every enemy on the map before jumping down to a new section. Now, if your whole team's up there and they're doing some sniping before jumping down, that's pretty much fine. But if you're up there all by yourself and trying to do the cool lone wolf thing of sniping enemies while reciting prayers to the Emperor, the game will often spawn stun-locking enemies like Poxhounds or Trappers directly behind you.
Blessed be the Lord my strength, who teaches my hands to war, and my fingers.
If you're not able to dodge or deal with these enemies quickly enough, there is no counterplay once they grab you. You need a teammate to come help you. Adopt the buddy system and make sure that you're not the only one standing on one of these ledges. If somebody does get hit by a Poxhound, you can potentially knock them off by putting a grenade on the ally's body, and some players have even suggested once you see a Poxhound to drop a grenade on yourself, in case that will knock the Poxhound off if it does end up grabbing you, which is some pretty solid counterplay, but I wouldn't 100% rely on it to keep yourself safe. Another important part of teamwork is highlighting and calling out enemies. Fights can evolve very quickly if the AI spawns a ton of elite enemies and your team isn't able to deal with them fast enough. But one way you can help your team killing them is by highlighting them. There is a highlight keybind in the settings, and you should use that basically as often as possible to mark out enemies, especially when they're in hordes. This is going to make it easier for your sniper characters like Psykers or Sharpshooters to neutralize those elite enemies as quickly as possible. Remapping that key can be an easy way to use it more often. Another suggestion that a lot of players had was to remap it to your primary attack button. This means that anytime you're shooting at or attacking an enemy, you're automatically going to be highlighting it as well. With basically, without even thinking about it or trying, you're going to be highlighting a lot of stuff. That's going to help just clean up the battlefield for your team and differentiate those elites when they're surrounded by a horde of poxwalkers. You can also use it to highlight equipment that you may not necessarily need, or to inform your team of where you're going. If you go off to the side and your team doesn't know what you're doing, you can highlight that you're going to look for some ammo. This does get a little funky if your primary mouse button is also your highlight key. I don't believe the game accepts multiple key bindings for a single command, so you just end up sort of swinging wildly at ammo or crafting materials or boxes that you're trying to highlight. But using those controls is absolutely key to good teamwork. Now, another thing that's very important in the heat of a huge battle is understanding the blocking and pushing mechanics. I mentioned in my previous video that combat ends up being kind of a dance between block, push, attack, and dodge. Now, a couple things you might not know about blocking specifically is that when you're blocked, it actually deflects damage from all angles. It's a 360-degree ability, which means that even an opponent attacking you from behind will be blocked even if you're holding your sword up in front of you in the animation. This means it can be useful if you hear that backstrike sound effect we talked about in the previous video to block even if you can't see what's attacking you, because oftentimes that will stop them from doing damage entirely. You can also block while resurrecting fallen allies. If you're going through the animation to untie them from a trapper net, pick them up from the ground after being knocked, or untie them once they're captured, holding down the block key while you're going through that animation will still actually continue to block in a 360-degree radius. Oftentimes, it's good to use a crowd control effect once you go in to try to res an enemy using a frag grenade, a force push, or potentially a stun grenade, which is probably the best one from the Zealot class, or even just the Ogryn Stampede to knock everyone over, means that they're going to take a couple seconds to get back up. That will probably only leave a couple of them to attack you, and you can easily block that damage while you're resing your ally. Importantly, speaking of the Ogryn also don't get staggered when enemies attack you while they're resing allies. This is one of the reasons that they end up being kind of more of a support class than a full-on damage tank. They're very good at resing, and they're also very good at carrying items, since they're not slowed by carrying things like power cells or canisters for missions. While Ogryns tend to be big targets and end up taking a ton of damage, especially at higher levels, they can be useful in some tight fights where the rest of the team's going down, and Ogryn can very easily get them back up. Moving on, we talked a little bit about dealing with elite enemies earlier in this video, and in fact, I made an entire video on the strengths and weaknesses of each elite enemy in the game, which I highly recommend you go check out. Earlier on in the video, we talked a little bit about dealing with elite enemies, especially highlighting them for the rest of your team to deal with. But the other thing to keep in mind when you're attacking elite enemies is their armor variety. Different enemy types have different armor levels on their various body parts. These are broken down into a couple different armor types, including Flak, which is relatively light, Unyielding, which is fairly heavy, and Carapace, which is almost impenetrable, as well as Maniac armor, which actually reduces more damage the higher damage of the attack incoming is. Knowing the different armor types and where they're located on each of the enemies is a huge deal. For example, your normal scabs, these standard traitor guardsmen that you'll fight most often in the game, typically have flak armor on their heads, torsos, and arms. Some scabs will have unarmored arms but more base hit points, whereas the dregs, the yellow-robed cultists, are almost entirely unarmored, however, have more base hit points. Elite enemies also have oftentimes odd armor distribution. For example, Maulers having Carapace armor on their heads, whereas they have flak armor on the rest of their body, making them almost immune to headshots, but take much more damage from shooting center mass. The same goes for Reapers, the big Ogryn with the twin-linked stubber gun, which has unyielding armor on its head and arms, Carapace armor on some of the armor-plated areas of its body, but much lighter flak armor on its chest. A tool that I didn't know about for an embarrassingly long amount of time was the meat grinder in the Psychania. Once you're max level, this unlocks all of the enemies in the game, unfortunately not monstrosities, but you can see all of the standard and elite enemies and take practice attacking them. This gives you a good idea of how much damage your weapons should do, how many attacks you should expect to take to kill a specific enemy, and exactly where the armor is on each of those enemies. It sort of goes without saying, but enemies with very heavy armor, especially things like Crushers that have extremely heavy armor all the way around their body, you should be prioritizing heavy attacks against, whereas Maniac armor, which reduces more damage the larger the incoming attack is, you should be prioritizing small damage attacks. So you're looking for light attacks against things like mutants, Dreg Ragers, the ones with no shirts on, Flamers, and Trappers, which all have Maniac armor, whereas those big Maulers and Crushers, you should be holding down that attack button to be doing big, massive attacks on individually to try to pierce through that armor. Looking for weapons that have a high armor piercing value helps you deal with these heavily armored enemies as well, and it's a little hidden in the menus, but all of your weapons actually have a statistical readout, which you can view in your inventory or in the shop if you're viewing an item that's available for sale, so you can see how much damage it does against particular armor types. Now, speaking of enemy types, one that I've actually realized that there is a lot of confusion about within the community is Daemonhosts. These are those weird, whispering folks that we find occasionally on the ground, more often during the power failure special modifier for missions, and pretty often at the higher levels of play. You can basically... What are you doing? Hello? Oh, where are you going? Going down? All right, you can sit down. When they spawn, they're curled up on the ground in a fetal position, surrounded by a dark mist and whispering constantly. And you can hear that whispering in the back of your head basically as soon as they spawn. Now, Daemonhosts are actually entirely harmless until you wake them up. And this goes through two stages. You actually have a little bit of a grace period, so it's a little tougher to wake them up than you would normally think. First off, if you move within their vicinity, you'll have the chance to wake them up. The radius that this occurs at is reduced if you crouched, but increase if you sprint. So sneaking along gives you the best chance of not triggering the demon host. As soon as they're triggered, they'll raise up above the ground, start wiggling around, and glow a sickly green. Now, while this does look scary and intimidating, this doesn't actually mean the demon host is going to attack you. You actually have to trigger them a second time in order for them to actually attack your party. This means that as long as you're being careful, it's actually kind of difficult to be attacked. You can also wake them up by shooting them, and at this point, if you continue to move closer to them, or you make any attacks against them or deal any damage, they will begin to attack. Once the demon host attacks, they will immediately aggro to whoever startled them that second time, which means that you get to harass mercilessly whoever is currently being hit by the demon host. Their attacks have a pretty wide swing arc, which means that there's a chance they could hit nearby enemies around them, and they're incredibly quick, basically impossible to dodge or run away from. If you do end up escaping, they will quickly teleport back to your position, making them basically inescapable. This doesn't mean that they automatically kill you, however. You can block their attacks, and while they'll drain your stamina pretty quickly, that can keep you safe for a little while. The most effective way to stop them is an Ogryn with a slab shield. If the Ogryn sets down their slab shield and makes themselves immune to damage, they'll actually continue to take a little bit of corruption damage as the demon host wails on them, but be relatively unscathed and give the rest of the party the opportunity to focus down the demon host and kill them. They have a high damage reduction, so it's difficult to take them down, but focus fire and heavy weapons will eventually get there. Now, if the demon host kills its initial target, it will aggro to another player and will try to kill them as well. If either target is incapacitated by the demon host, they'll do like a force choke animation. They'll raise you up above the ground and then immediately knock you to casualty, regardless of how many wounds you have remaining. So the demon host is essentially inescapable, and if it kills you, you die in real life. Once it aggroes to a second player, it will attempt to kill that player, and if it does so, you'll find it return to the warp and actually leave your party alone. Even if you trigger a demon host and you don't have a good way to block it enough to stop it from killing you, it will only ever kill 2 players, and as long as those players don't respawn too far away, the remaining 2 players may have the chance to salvage the run by going and grabbing them. This makes the demon host, while extremely dangerous, not an immediate party wipeout. Demon hosts are actually pretty nice like that. They won't kill everyone, just 2 of you. Now, I mentioned they deal corruption damage, and that's one further mechanic that I don't think is elucidated very well in the game that I'd like to explain. Corruption damage is the purple bar that's applied to your health bar, whereas normally the white health bar would be drained by normal damage. The corruption damage sort of takes it over. This is still normal damage, so your total pool of hit points is reduced by corruption damage. This corruption damage cannot be healed except by a Medicae servitor, so you can't throw down a health box and get rid of it. The divisions in your health bar are wounds that your health is divided into, and every time you die and are raised back, one of these will be taken over by corruption damage. But this means that corruption damage that is sustained in other ways will slowly drain the amount of available wounds that you have, until even regular damage will just immediately send you to casualty instead of allowing you to be rezzed by your team. Now, the little known thing is that you can actually get corruption damage a couple different ways, not just from dying and being rezzed. Some types of enemies, specifically infested enemies, which are poxhounds, pox walkers, and pox bursters, all deal corruption damage in addition to some normal damage. Every time one of these enemies hits you, you're going to take a little bit of corruption damage, usually in addition to any damage to your toughness. So even if you have toughness remaining, it will still eat away at your base hit points. Now, there are other ways to take on corruption as well. One of the most impactful is the Beast of Nurgle monstrosity. These things basically do almost entirely corruption damage, and just being around them will slowly tick up corruption, as standing in their slime trails gives you a ton of corruption. If they vomit on you, you'll also be affected by a status effect that slowly ticks up corruption, and if they eat you, they're going to dump a ton of corruption on you. Generally speaking, the corruption doesn't actually kill you, but it does make you significantly easier to kill, reducing your total number of hit points. The corruptors, the demons that you have to expunge in order to complete many mission objectives, also have the chance to deal a little bit of corruption damage. Once you kill these things, you'll see that they explode into a yellow mist, and standing inside this yellow mist will actually tick up your corruption. The same for walking into the flames of a Tox Flamer. Those also leave a persistent AoE on the ground that will not only knock out your toughness, but also deal you some corruption damage for sitting in it. Especially if you're relying on med packs for your team, corruption damage is no good. So avoiding these AoEs and avoiding these types of enemies is a good way to not get totally owned. Also, it certainly helps to keep your high wounds count around. That means that even if you do get killed by conventional damage, you won't automatically be killed because of the corruption eating away at your wounds. And with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up the video. Thanks so much for watching. I hope these hints can improve your games of Darktide. And with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up the video. Thanks so much for watching all the way to the end. I hope these hints can improve your games of Darktide. Thanks as well to everyone who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are great, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.